Oh, believe me, if all those endearing young chums that I gaze on so fondly today were to suddenly leave you or fly in the night, just like fairy gifts gone in the sky.
Man, what in the world is happening down at City Hall?
What is happening If you change your mind, take a chance on the first in line. Honey, I'm still free. Take a chance on me. If you need me, let me know. Gonna be around. If you got no place to go when you're feeling down. If you're all alone, when the pretty birds have flown, honey, I'm still free. Take a chance on me. Gonna do my very best, and it ain't no lie. If you put me to the test, if you let me try, take a chance on me. That's all I ask of you, honey. Take a chance on me. We can go dancing, we can go walking.
wake up, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who wakes up next to you. When I go out, yeah, I know I'm gonna be the man who goes along with you. If I get drunk, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who gets drunk next to you. And if I heaver, yeah, I know I'm gonna be the man who's heavering to you. But I would walk 500 miles and I would walk 500 more just to be the man who walked 1,000 miles then fall at your door. When I'm walking, yes, I know I'm gonna be the man who's working hard for you. And when the money comes in for the work I do, I'll pass almost every penny on to you. When I come home, oh, I know I'm gonna be the man who comes back home to you. And if I broke, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who's going over to you. But I would walk 500 miles and I would walk 500 more just to be the man who walks 1,000 miles to fall down at your door. When I'm lonely, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who's lonely without you. And when I'm dreaming, well, I know I'm gonna dream about the time when I'm with you. When I go out, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who goes along with you. And when I come home, yes, I know I'm gonna be the man who comes back home with you. I'm gonna be the man who's coming home with you. get up in the evening and I ain't got nothing to say. I come home in the morning, I go to bed feeling the same way. I ain't nothing but tired. Man, I'm just tired and bored with myself. Hey there, baby, I could use just a little help. You can't start a fire. You can't start a fire without a spark. This gun's for hire. Even if we're just dancing in the dark.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Mike Stritch. For those that don't know me, I'm the Chief Investment Officer here for BMO in the US. And very excited today to bring you the next episode in our webinar series entitled Back to School and COVID. Certainly a topic on many people's mind these days, and myself included as a father of 3 young girls. For the discussion today, we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. John White, who is the Chief Medical Officer at WebMD, a site that I'm sure many, if not all of you, are quite familiar with. And in this role, Dr. White leads efforts to foster discussions, create change around important and timely public health issues. Certainly, we have an important and timely health issue today. Prior to joining WebMD, Dr. White served as the Director of Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the US FDA. He's also a board-certified internist and continues to see patients. I could go on, of course, about Dr. White and his bio, but more information can be found on the WebMD page. A quick Google search, though, does demonstrate that he is indeed at the center of the discussion around COVID-19, as evidenced by the many videos and articles you can see published alongside notable professors, business leaders, and government officials. In fact, I think he's had several calls already today with many such individuals, and will continue to do so after our event as well. So as a reminder, please feel free to submit any questions you have for Dr. White through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I think you have to select all panelists from the drop-down, and then you type in your question. We've received several questions in advance, so we appreciate those, and please do continue sending them as we go throughout the presentation. Just a side note, we won't be covering any market or economic related questions today because a few of those have come through as well in the early questions. We'll tackle those in detail next week at our monthly financial market outlook call. So please do check back in with us for that session if you want more information on the financial markets and the current state of the economy. The agenda today, we're going to do 25 to 30 minutes of prepared kind of Q&A, a little discussion between Dr. White and myself, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time really answering your questions. So I do want to implore you to please submit those online should you have something topical that you would like to discuss. And so with that, Dr. White, I want to say thank you for joining us and welcome. It's great to have you. And maybe we can, indeed, and maybe we can start before we get into the specifics of children and COVID. Maybe we could just start with a quick update on the overall state of vaccine development in an effort to, conceivably put an end to this pandemic, at least in the short term here. What's happening of late, and that'll give us some good context to set up the rest of the discussion.
Sure. And always nice to be with you. I have 2 young boys that are entering school. But in terms of vaccines, let's try to keep perspective and stay within it. This is actually in phase 2. So as many of you know, 4 phase trials, they haven't even tested population they've approved vaccines. So that's a real concern. Where they think the population is strong. But
Hey, Dr. White, just real quick, can you hear me okay? Because I lost you a little bit. Can you hear me? Yeah. I don't know if maybe your pod went out. There, well, I think we maybe have you back there. Can't hear that. Can't hear that, do you? Always fun technical glitches. Let me see. We had you initially, and then we lost. So maybe, I don't know.
Now.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Well, see, that's what happens with technology.
Yes, on the fly addiction. I like it. So maybe we can go back to the vaccine start. We had maybe a sentence, and then I started to fade out.
I'm glad it worked out. So today, Russia announced, did I get to that point, that they approved a vaccine?
That was it.
And here they're in phase 2. They're not even in phase 3. So there's a lot of push to have a vaccine. And there's 27 candidates currently in trials. 6 are in phase 3. But keep this in mind. You have to have 30,000 people in these phase 3 trials. We're at 5,000 for most of them, and this is August. So think about, we need to get 25,000 more people. We need to wait 2 weeks. We need to hope they get exposed to the virus. We need to compare it to a control, and then it all needs to be reviewed. So, realistically, to say something like, it's possible this year, everything would have to align. And that just doesn't seem realistic. Is it first quarter more possible? Maybe. But the other point I wanted to bring up is we're all saying we have to wait for a vaccine. We can't open the schools until we have a vaccine. We can't open, the work environments until we have a vaccine. We did a survey at WebMD, which was replicated elsewhere, that talked about the majority of people say they may not get the vaccine. Less than 25% said they would get it in the first 120 days. Because what are people saying? You know what, Mike, I'm going to wait and see how you do with it before I get it. So what's our plan B if we don't, either A, have a vaccine, or B, that enough people aren't willing to take the vaccine, either concerns about safety or effectiveness, and we don't reach herd immunity. So we need to start having a discussion around how do we mitigate transmission? What do we do in terms of living with the virus if we need to? Certainly, we should push more on the vaccine, and we should all be optimistic about a vaccine. But we also have to be realistic that the timeline seems overly aggressive, and Canadians' Public Health Minister, Dr. Tam, said we're in this for another year or two. Even if there is a vaccine, early next year, that's only going to be the populations that are higher risk, perhaps people in nursing homes, first-line responders, health professionals. Before it gets to the general population, it can be many months after that. So I really wanted to bring that up, and we need to think about a plan B. How do we continue to manage and live with COVID while not having a lockdown strategy?
Well, that's great. I think that's perfect context for the discussion today, because so many people, I think, are viewing this back to school season in a very sort of one-time, it'll be here and then we'll have a vaccine and it'll be over. And I think what you're saying, for a myriad of reasons, not the least of which is just proving the vaccine is successful in the right amount of people, but also getting to that stage where enough people have it to make it meaningful, is going to be a while. So this is an important dialogue, and things will continue to evolve as we go forward. But again, it's great to be sitting here with you today talking about this. So in moving into kind of the school aspect of this, and maybe we'll start with just some thought around just children and the virus specifically, and then we can talk about protocols and parameters for in-school or out-of-school sessions. Yeah. So let me start here and ask you, where are we as to our understanding of how the disease does impact children?
Yeah,
it does seem like that's less likely to get, the COVID, but is it rare? Is it, how would you categorize all that?
So here's a couple numbers to consider. There's over 5 million confirmed cases of COVID. 338,000 are in children. 100,000 of those cases have been within the past 2 weeks. And there have been less than 100 deaths of children. Some of it has been due to this multi-inflammatory system syndrome, and it's always devastating, particularly when we hear about a child death. But less than 100 338,000. Sometimes just having worked at FDA in terms of what rare means in terms of a rare disease, but I'm going to use it in the general, parlance. It is pretty rare, for children to have a serious infection which requires hospitalization. And death from COVID-19 is very rare. That doesn't mean that it doesn't occur and that we can't be vigilant. We have to be vigilant, but we have to keep that in mind, that the risk in children is very low. And we should think about that as we start to, develop strategies about school. But having said that, what about transmission, child to child or adult to adult, and then children to adult? So, school-age children, typically, kids in elementary school are different than high school kids who are more like adults. What we think in younger children, all of them, their lungs are not as developed as adults. So in some ways, they cannot expel as much virus. So remember, this is a respiratory virus. It's from, expelling virus from your lungs in your mouth. So kids don't have that pliability of their trachea and some aspects of their lungs to expel as much virus. We think there's some of that. We also think in terms of they don't have as many receptors in their lungs. So the virus attaches to these receptors on our lungs. They have not developed as many. So that may also be why they don't get infected as often as adults. And when they do, they don't have as serious a condition. But the challenge is we really need more data. The schools have been closed for the most part, since March. So what's going to happen when we start have, children around each other more and adults? So we're still learning, but most of the data shows it's not as serious in children. How much of a spread they are to adults is still something that we're looking into. And this is the point, as you and I have talked about, we need to look at data and we need to be guided, by data.
And you touched on it a bit there. Expand on this idea of all ages being, created equal. And when you say children, like, what's the term that what are you thinking about when you think children in the disease? How do you bucket those?
Yeah, I think of children, and a lot of people do, typically less than, when we're thinking of less than 2 digits. So usually less than 10. And we know that as we have children, they're very different. They're not mini adults. And sometimes we think that. So what happens in adult is the same, and that happens in, children that are still very much developing their organs, their nervous system, their circulatory system, et cetera. And we need to make those distinctions. And Canada actually has made some of those distinctions in terms of their school policies. So again, it goes back to, if I don't expel as much virus, I'm not going to contaminate as many people. If I don't have as many receptors in my lungs because I'm still developing, then I'm less likely to, get the virus. Nothing is absolutely certain, but we're looking at relative risk and balancing that against the benefits of, being in school, having social interactions. And we really should stop this one size fits all approach. But it's based on science and physiology. Like, that's the key element that I want people to think about.
And so just to belabor this point a bit, but we do have a lot of questions that cover, the spectrum, college questions, right? So that puts it almost into, I'm just extrapolating your comments into an adulthood sort of comparable, maybe not exact. And then you talked about under 10, and we have a lot of questions around the kind of really little children. Then there's that middle ground, as a newly parent of a teenager here for the first time, 13-year-old, that middle bucket. Are you saying we should think about distinctions between those 3 types of groups maybe, or is it not that? I mean, I know it's all sort of evolving, but is that the right way to think about it?
So some of it is, and some of it's the physiology in terms of how their bodies function, right? So that's a key element in terms of their immune system as well, and the development of the immune system. So there's the physiology, but then there's also the behavior patterns, the social behavior. So, college students are very different in terms of their social interactions with each other than, a bunch of elementary school students. High school students are probably more similar to college students. And then middle school is kind of in between. So the 12, 13, 14 is kind of a mix, and they're going to be different. And we see that, in general. Some are more, socially developed than others. Some people have a little bit of a development delay. But I really would start to think about how do we differentiate them based on their physiology. In kids less than 10 are very different in kids, older than 16. And then what are their behaviors and how do they interact with each other? But we haven't done that, Mike. We kind of treated everyone as K through 12. They're all the same, at least here in the United States. That's different elsewhere.
Yeah, indeed. We were chatting beforehand about that fact when it comes to a lot of surveys and questions that were asked of people and commentary. It does seem to be one big broad bucket of children. So that's a good takeaway for everyone to realize that it's not that simple. It should be bifurcated along some of those dimensions that you mentioned. And when it comes to school policy, so now thinking about the actual state of affairs and where we're at and where we're going, my observation is there seem to be about as many plans for reopening as there are school districts in the U.S. at this point, and they are changing seemingly by the day. And I know you personally are involved in advising some school districts and have had discussions with doctors and officials around the country on this very topic, of course. As a starting point, how do you feel about the current state of affairs when it comes to these reopening plans and the approaches being taken across the U.S.?
And I'll start off with the United States. And I looked it up, Mike, because we were talking about there's over 131,000 school districts in the United States. So there's a lot. And if you look at them, with the exception of New York, most of the bigger school districts have ultimately moved on to a virtual, moved to a virtual online platform, at least for some portion of the school year early on. And as you mentioned, I've been very involved with my school district for kids. What's been frustrating is that we're not looking at data in the local area. And I think that's what's important that New York City has done. They said, we're going to be able to open schools if it's less than 3%, in the community. So we're able to look at data. I can look at infection rate, hospitalization rate, and deaths in my zip code. In most elementary schools, at least, are around a couple of zip codes. And, people that work there might be from, a zip code nearby. So I can look at the data and I can see what's happening with infection, and I can have good predictors. And I've talked about this at meetings, and, people will say to me, well, data needs to be balanced by fear. And, initially I'm like, well, what does that even mean? And I don't mean to diminish or dismiss people's fears, but when we're talking about risk, and that's really what we're talking about, the risk of getting COVID in school, the risk of teachers, grandparent caregivers being affected by COVID and having a bad outcome, versus the issues of food insecurity, versus the issues of not getting, your development that you need to progress and perhaps causing development delay, being risk at home for a variety, of reasons with parents that are stressed, the economy. These are real issues. And what I've been frustrated by is it's not a one size fits all. What's going to happen in the school is a reflection of what's going to happen in the community. There are 20 states that have had no infections in children, none. Zero. So should everyone's policy be the same? I don't think it should be. And I'm not suggesting that, schools have to reopen by any means, but we need to look at what's happening in your local area. You need to look at what's happening in the community, and then, have a, data-driven decision-making process. And that's the challenge.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, some data is better, some areas make data more readily and easily available than others, of course. So just finding out that information is sometimes a trick, as we've often talked about on our other calls when trying to get a gauge on what's exactly happening. But as it comes to the data, and maybe I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I know there's no precise answer on this, but I like the idea of thinking local. I like the idea of zip codes. I heard you say a 3% positivity rate from New York. I think the general guideline from the World Health Organization is somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5% number.
That's right. Yes.
Greater than 5 is bad, and less than 5 is good. I'm sure what are the numbers that would give you pause as a parent of young children in a local area that would say, well, maybe this is a little bit more than I want to deal with?
But I also want to look at trends. So, sometimes we look at 7-day rolling averages. That's important because that's telling me. I want to look at, just as you do, in other areas of economics, the trends. Are we going up? Or are we going down? Like, that's an important point as well. And, sometimes the data is not as best as we would like, but we actually do have pretty good counting overall. So those are the things. If my, positivity case is in, 20% or 15%, I'm going to be like, oh, hey, there is a lot of infection in the community. Let's not bring it into the school, right? But if it's 5%, 4%, and it's either staying there or going down and there's no hospitalizations, and we can practice, social distancing and be creative, then I think there's some rationale. No one is talking about, oh, hey, okay, well, maybe we'll have grades, 1 through 6 or 1 through 8 come in because they can't do as well online in terms of virtual learning, especially, K through 3. And maybe they come in alternate days, and then maybe, 9 through 12 are all virtual. So at least somehow we can balance that until we figure out, what's happening in the community. Or, we can convert the gyms, the cafeterias, and conference rooms to more space for kids. But we're not considering that enough in terms of the communities. And that's what I'm not seeing versus some of the things that they're doing in Canada in terms of being, more creative. Of course, the population is different in terms of size, but that's what we should be thinking about. And a lot of people have argued, well, if you want to reopen the schools, don't reopen the bars and the restaurants and the gyms and all of those other things, because that's what's impacting spread in the community. And we need to have this comprehensive approach. The other thing, Mike, that makes it challenging, and I get it, is when one school district becomes virtual, what happens to contiguous districts? It makes it harder because parents, teachers may not. The teachers may have children, and in their district it might be open, and in another district it might be virtual. So it gets very confusing when districts around each other have different policies. And what I've been seeing is they tend to become more in line, and that makes sense, but it may not always make sense based on the data. And I think it's very challenging, and it comes down to that people are fearful. People are scared. They don't want to get infected. They don't want their children to be infected. They didn't, become a teacher to become infected. And those are all valid concerns. But how do we address those fears? How do we address the unintended consequences as well? And how do we figure out how to live with the virus? You can't say keep the schools open until there's a vaccine, and then you say, well, I'm not going to take the vaccine, for the first 3 months. Then we are nowhere in March and April than we are today. And you're just going to become virtual all year. And that's not going to work in grades 1, 2, 3. And it's just not realistic.
Yeah, and beyond, I would say that even past grades, 2 and 3, it's still a challenge for sure.
Absolutely.
So, maybe one more question, then we can move on to talk about protocol for opening schools. Just some of the things as those areas that are open, best practice and the like. You mentioned Canada, some things they're doing. Of course, other countries, Germany, Japan, Sweden, schools have been reopened recently, or some never closed. Is there anything that you want to point to there? Lessons learned, other things that might be relevant here?
So Sweden never closed their schools, and they really didn't change the rules much in terms of society. But one point is kids 16 and older actually stayed home. So that's the point where they really differentiated. Kids aren't all the same. Kids that are 16 plus really function more as adults in terms of infection. And what their comparator is that they were no different in terms of infection and transmission than, say, neighboring Finland. So, there still were cases, there still were deaths. I'm not sure, how much we can make of that, but that's often used as an example. I'm not sure if that's a good example. But that's what happened in Sweden in terms of keeping the schools open. Israel reopened the schools early. They then had lots of infection spread and had to close it down. But that's also what was happening in the community. This is my point. If there's not low transmission in the community, then you're going to have infection in the school. They're completely tied. The schools aren't some separate entity. They're a reflection, of the community. Germany's actually reopening schools now. For a long period of time, they had only had 100, 200, 300 cases a day for the entire country versus, we're having 50, 60, 70,000 a day. They're up to 1,000 a day, but they're reopening the schools and we'll see. Dr. Fauci has talked about we really need to get down to 10,000 cases a day to get this under control. And, we're typically in tens of thousands, of cases. But when you look at all this data, there's still this idea that there is low child-to-child transmission, but it's not zero. And that's what we also need to talk about, Mike. What's our risk tolerance? Can we say it's going to be zero risk? That's not realistic. So what's the balance? And how do we have more effective strategies to really mitigate risk?
Indeed, that is the fundamental question, how to strike the right balance. There was another question or two that came in here on, similar line, but just about daycare.
Yeah.
Any insights on that? I mean, that's something that you don't hear too much about, at least I don't, just generally. I know there's many daycare providers remained open throughout the life of the, 2020 here. So have we learned anything in that sense for that? That's a very small, young age there, obviously.
That's right. And there have been some outbreaks, particularly in Texas lately, but I looked up some data on that. And Brown studied 916 daycare centers over the past couple of months that took care of 20,000 children. And what they found was just 1% of staff got infected and less than 0.15% of kids got infected. But here's what they found. They found there was low child to adult transmission. If adults got infected, it usually was from other adults. But they had these safeguards where each adult took care of fewer than 9 children, whatever, the ages. They had temperature checks on everyone daily. They had symptom checks on everyone daily. Those that did not feel well, either, the children themselves, by report of their parents or themselves, or the teacher stayed home. They had, aggressive hand washing, and they had mask wearing of everyone. So, did that help in terms of these safeguards? We tend to think they did, but, it goes to your point. A lot of daycare centers out there, some got impacted, but the majority didn't. What can we learn? And that's what we're seeing. And it's not surprising. So they had hand washing, they had mask wearing, they had social distancing, and people that didn't feel well were, told not to come in.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point to transition on there in terms of protocol. I think it sets the stage nicely. And let me start with this in terms of, thinking about how to handle in-person education here.
Yeah.
A lot of questions, and I had this on my list to ask you anyway, but a lot of questions on mask wearing all over the board in terms of masks. So maybe start with this idea of, should everyone wear a mask in school? This is the starting sort of question. Then we'll build on that because there's a lot of other sort of tangential questions and points.
Yeah, I had mentioned to you before we started, this call that I was on with Dr. Redfield, the director of the CDC, just immediately prior to this call, and asked him that question. He said 100% mask wearing, 100% mask wearing, including in the schools by all children. So in the United States, we say greater than age 2. Most states are saying that. Development appropriate, age appropriate, to try to have them wear the mask all day in school. In Canada, it's age 10 that's required, encouraged less than age 10. But, Dr. Fauci has said the same thing, 100% mask wearing.
And
it's a respiratory virus. That's how it's transmitted, respiratory droplets primarily. You got to wear the mask right. But that, and, you and I talked about for kids, and I have young kids, I made sure I got them masks that fit more than one. So I had to look around a little for masks for 5-year-olds as well as 7-year-olds. And then we practice wearing them. And, not for long periods of the day, but for certain periods of the day, just so they get used to it. You can't expect that your child has never put on a mask and then you're going to send them to school and they're all of a sudden now have to wear a mask the whole time. So it's good to practice these behaviors at home now.
Yeah. And is there, again, just looking through these questions, there's a couple of questions around the idea of are the masks safe to wear for little kids? And, do you want to diffuse that sort of line of thinking? Or I don't know the basis of that. I think there's been some articles around, breathing and things like that, but how would you address?
There's no data to support that masks are unsafe either for adults or children. Benefits of mask wearing for respiratory virus when you're around other people are significantly greater, than any risks. I think for, little kids, especially, where masks at first are kind of uncomfortable. You're not used to that wearing, and that, may give you some angst. And that's why you need, to practice it. I'm not suggesting that, kids wear masks when they're, by themselves or with their siblings in the home, but in the other setting, when you're around other people, you should. That's how we're going to reduce transmission. And, if you're concerned about getting COVID, then you should be having your children, to wear a mask. In the overall scheme of things, there's much more benefit to it.
And then if, the other thing that, of course, we often talk about is social distancing. And I've heard all kinds of different approaches in this regard as it relates to school plans from, the cohorts, separate desks, no transfer of classrooms, and no recess in some, in smaller settings. But, what is your sense on an optimal set of best practices as it relates to this concept of social distancing in a school environment?
And we've had different, lengths at different points in times, whether it's 2 meters or 6 feet. Some people are saying now, a meter or 3 feet will be sufficient. But I actually want to give credit to people in Ontario and Toronto who have talked about not this one size fits all approach. So I think what they've been doing is very good, where they're saying elementary school comes back, right, full time in Ontario, and high school students split the time between classroom and on-time learning. But to your point, they're in a single cohort. They stay together, including lunch and recess, so they're not being exposed to a lot of other children. That everyone is having, temperature checks, which I think is an imperfect measure, but it's something. You're having, screening, symptoms. You're doing hand washing. So I think it's those kind of elements that, people are trying to do. They're even talking about you're going to have assigned seating on the bus. So if there is an infection, you're able to trace, everyone that the child might have been exposed to. So I think that's important. And then they also said in high population areas, people are going to attend school, every other day. So they're trying to address these areas where they're also using, as I mentioned before, the gyms, the cafeteria, other spaces other than classroom to make into classrooms to kind of have that distance. And that's what I think are those good measures that they're trying to incorporate. And granted, every school and every school district isn't going to have the resources to do that. But this is where we need to start thinking about, creative ways to stay sane, right? And stay safe, and, recognize the value of going back to school.
Yeah, and on the going back and thinking about parents, in addition to sending their children back, is there anything you might recommend that they do, or maybe you're doing with your kids to sort of suggest appropriate ways to engage at school, and not just with their peers, but some questions have come in around eating lunch or sanitizer usage, right? Personal sanitizer, utensils, and again, all these schools would be probably having a different set of protocol. And I'm suspecting it's not a lot of sharing will be going on regardless, but just some ideas that you're thinking about that you might want to say to all the parents on the line. This is the conversation you'd want to have, and here's some Here's
Yeah.
some things that you should think about.
And I do want to say, in many areas of the country where there's high infection rates, that starting the school year online makes a lot of sense. Infection rates can get under control and really get a handle on the virus and figure out what's the best strategy to keep everyone safe. So saying it for the first couple of weeks or saying it for the first quarter in many districts makes sense. Well, I think the conversation with kids depends on the age, and developmental, level. So for me, for younger kids who are into sharing things and touching things, it's talking to kids again, as we always have to, about boundaries in terms of not sharing utensils at school, not having sadly in some ways displays of affection for a period of time in school. I think for the older kids, and I've got to be honest, I see a lot of teenagers out and about. If I drive to my local Starbucks and they're not wearing masks and they're all around each other talking, it's a reminder to them of why we're doing this. It's not just to protect them, it's to protect, they might impact someone who then affects an elderly grandparent who doesn't do well. That's the issue that we have to remind, teenagers who may not always think about the community, about how their behavior may actually put someone else at risk, even if it's not themselves or their immediate loved ones. And then really going over, with everyone, what do we do in terms of how long do we do hand washing? Why the mask is wearing is so important. There is this concept that I've been talking about called caution fatigue, right? It's hard to stay on high alert. In March, we were told this was only going to be 15 days. And what are we, 6 months later? And with no end in sight. So, people get tired of doing it and they're not sure what to do and they're stressed and they're anxious. But now is not the time, especially now, not to pull back on, these public health measures that we know work.
Yeah. And let me last question here. I mean, I'm inserting a lot of questions from the audience, but I want to turn my attention solely to some of these other questions that are coming in real time here. Take the teacher's lens. Certainly an age bracket, right? Different set of risks that are associated.
Absolutely.
How do you think about sort of advising teachers and administrators to manage their own personal safety in such a setting?
And we absolutely have to protect the teachers, the administrators, the other employees. Realistically, they're at greater risk than the kids. Many of them are older. They have comorbidities such as diabetes and hypertension. We need to make sure that they have the equipment that they need to have a mask. They may need a face shield depending upon, what community they're in. We need to, have enough, sanitizers and I've been hearing these reports where teachers are in some districts have to buy these materials themselves. That's not right. We need to keep the teachers safe as well and manage the risk. It's the same with health professionals who are even at greater risk, every day of going in. We have to give them the tools to stay safe while they're managing care of patients. We need to give teachers tools to, manage their risk as well. And again, it still goes back to what's happening in the community is what's happening in the schools. So if there's high infection rate, that doesn't make sense that you're keeping gyms and restaurants and, other places open, and then you expect that not to occur in the school. If we suppress the virus in the community, we're going to suppress it in the schools. There's going to be lower transmission rates, lower infection. People are going to be safer, including the teachers. In the meantime, everyone still has to, practice those safeguards. And for those teachers and administrators and employees who are at, greater risk, lots of school districts have been offering hybrid options in terms of for the teachers as well, that, prefer to work from home because they're at increased risk and they should, use those opportunities if those arise.
So on the risk side, there's a few questions that have come in as it relates to that, just in terms of, let me start with this one here on, what's the severity of the impact you said the children don't get that much of a severe outbreak, that's the general sort of idea, but what is the sort of level of, I mean, not the spectrum, because I think there's the whole spectrum is possible,
Yeah.
but what's kind of the average set of what we might see as symptoms and struggles with the disease in children? And we'll define the children in this case under 10 again for you.
Yeah. Children in general have the same symptoms as adults. There's not a different presentation. It's usually cough, it's usually fever, it's usually shortness of breath. Those are the typical symptoms in children as they are in adults. But they can also have headaches and diarrhea and other symptoms. Those can be other things as well, not just, COVID. But remember, 338,000 cases, that's a lot of cases, less than 100 deaths, less than 90 deaths as of this morning. Serious complication is still very, very rare. They still can get it, so that's why we want to practice all of those safeguards, but we have some confidence that children under 10 are not going to become very sick from COVID.
Mm-hmm. Good. And there's a couple of questions or a number of questions actually that I would. Thank you everyone for your questions. Please do continue to submit those. There's a handful that I would categorize as very situationally specific, asking about a set of circumstances for an individual child, asthma and the like. Is there any? We hear a lot about pre-existing conditions in adults and how that raises the chance of an adverse outcome. Do we have the same type of data in children, and maybe the same type of pre-existing conditions don't exist? But I'm curious how that looks.
Yeah, if children are undergoing chemotherapy, because there are some cancers that occur in children, they are at greater risk. Because remember, that's a decrease in the immune system. Interestingly, in terms of asthma, there's been some mixed data. Most people say what puts someone at risk, including children, is if they're uncontrolled asthma. So if their asthma is not being treated well, they're at greater risk. If they simply have asthma that's being managed well, that doesn't put them at increased risk. But, there aren't as many conditions in children, luckily, that increase their risk. The biggest one is if for some reason, such as cancer or some other diseases in children, that makes them immunocompromised, because then their immune system is weakened. And if you think about it, that makes sense. So if, they're being exposed potentially to a virus when they have a weakened immune system, they're more likely, to have a bad response to that virus than someone who doesn't have any conditions. It's usually, though, a condition that makes them immunocompromised.
Okay. Let me go back to, one more question on the schools. I want to go back to just the general overall therapies and vaccines, because there's a number of follow-up questions that come in on that. One thing I did not ask you is there will be cases that are identified in a school setting. It's unclear that there's any, again, you're much closer to it than I am. I haven't seen a lot of details around protocol or what will happen when that eventuality does happen. Of course, Major League Baseball is an example where it's not clear that they've had a perfectly lined up sort of protocol or something like that. So then they spend a ton of time organized centrally. What are thoughts around sort of best practices or general consensus on how to handle, cases in a school setting?
Yeah. I've been on some calls with various school districts that have asked the same question. And there have been at times other people on the phone have said, well, when there's a case, we're going to have to shut down the district. Okay, that makes no sense, because the response has been they come into contact, with kids that go to other schools and shut down the whole chain. That makes no sense. That's a knee-jerk reaction that's over the top. What we have to do is really have this surgical scalpel approach rather than a sledgehammer. So you need to quickly, isolate, the person that's been affected. You have to do adequate contact tracing. That's why I love the idea from Toronto that kids are going to have, an assigned school seat, hopefully on the bus. Hopefully they'll do that. So then you can identify who they were around. And then you're going to quickly, test and quarantine those people. And that's why we need to have good testing as well. That's what makes sense, and not shutting down an entire district or even an entire school until you're able to contact trace and quarantine if necessary.
Yeah, that's
But
good.
that's the approach we need to take, and instead of this knee-jerk reaction, oh my gosh, we're going to have to, close down the school, because there are going to be cases. There are cases in the community. I know people are getting tired of me saying that. So there's going to be cases in the school, but it's such an important point, because if you want to make schools safer, make your community safer.
Great. So let's go back to the disease as a whole, and I'm going to start back to the vaccine. One of the questions that came in was, I don't think we heard you say specifically, well, two things. One, your optimism on a vaccine that will be produced. It sounds like you made some statements around, we will have it at this point. So the assumption there is that you believe that we're on a good trajectory, and that's actually going to follow through, and we will have a good workable vaccine in the near future. And when would you define, is that later this year?
I would say I'm optimistic, but I'm cautious, more so probably than others, because many vaccine trials, even in phase 3, after encouraging data, still fail. And how are we defining success? Now, several people, including Dr. Fauci, have suggested that if we have a vaccine that's 50% effective, that's good enough, or 50 to 60% effective. Usually our goal is to have a vaccine that's at least 70, 75% effective. So that means we're going to have to vaccinate a lot more people if it's only 50% effective. And I do have some concerns about people's willingness to get vaccinated. But still back to the issue of development. So we're talking, as I mentioned, we need 30,000 people in each of, the 5 trials that are going to go on. We need people to be, infected with the virus. And in some ways, the irony is the fact that there's high transmission actually makes recruitment and reaching, the trial endpoints effective. But then we really have to have, I'm going to be more confident if we really show the data that are out there and be very transparent. Right now, no one under 18 is being enrolled in trials, to my knowledge, on vaccines. And I just asked the CDC director, less than an hour ago. We have people older than 65, and that's great. So I'm not overly optimistic, certainly not by the end of the year. First quarter, I'm saying more first quarter, maybe, but we need to look at the data, and the history of vaccine development is more complicated than people are making it out to be. And again, unless you're one of those high priority populations, we're still talking many months after the vaccine. What's happening, what the US government is doing, is in some of these candidates, they're actually going to put them in production in phase 3. But what will happen is they don't prove safety and efficacy. There's going to be a lot of vaccine that's thrown out as well. So they're trying to rev it up to get things available. But I'm still waiting to look at data. And I'm not relying on abstracts.
Yeah, there's that balance again of risk and reward, I guess, in terms of fast tracking that and getting that set. Risk is, of course, misallocated funds and so on. But
that's right.
It would be, tremendously advantageous to have it sooner rather than later. What about
you see that? Yeah, but we don't say it's approved yet, obviously, as they are doing.
Yeah. What about therapeutics? I saw something the other day, maybe from the WHO, a formal pronouncement that they said that they're estimating the fatality rate now in the 0.6% range, I think, which is where we started 6 months ago, 2 to 3%, and I don't know if that's even the right number. But there's obviously been a lot of improvements in therapies, antiviral developments. Where do you feel like the fatality rate is in a general sense, and are you seeing any therapeutics on the horizon that will be as much of a game changer potentially as
absolutely, and it may be more realistic. I think as we've seen increase in number of cases, we actually don't see an increase in the rate of hospitalization. And we do see, a decrease in the rate of, fatality. And I think those are good signs. I think we've learned a lot of things over the past 6 months. First of all, we've learned more about the physiology of the disease. In some ways, we were treating it as an acute respiratory distress syndrome. Maybe we didn't have the right protocol settings on ventilators. If you remember, people that were put on ventilators, we were talking about 90, 95% fatality if you were put on a vent. So we've learned to change those ventilator protocols and have made progress there. I think we've learned a lot about the role of steroids. in terms of, treating cytokine storm that, may occur. We've learned about, anticoagulation that's necessary, as a potential treatment option for this. Look at where we are on remdesivir, and, potentially other treatments. Monoclonal antibodies may be a way to address this, in the short run. So we made a lot of progress on treatments, even just in the past 6 months. So I'm more optimistic in terms of where we'll be, in treatments, 3 months from now, 6 months from now. And that's why I think we're seeing progress in terms of, decreased mortality.
Yeah, that's good. That's good momentum there. A couple of questions. I'm not sure if we covered it a little bit in the earlier spreading conversation, but this idea of any evidence of, direct transmission from kids to adults, or the fact that maybe isn't as easily transmitted. It sounds like it would be, with the exception of less sort of exertion in terms of the lung capacity. But
right. I think there could be some transmission, but I will tell you, when they looked at a lot of adults and the studies that they've done in terms of adults and school kids and adults here, again, most of the time the adults became infected by other adults, either at home by someone else who worked or whoever worked in daycare or the school. So it's not impossible, child to adult, but we do think the risk of transmission is low. Not zero, but low.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to go back to the mask for another question.
Yeah.
Masks outside. A few people asked about that. What is the thoughts on wearing a mask outside? I don't know if that's probably a school-related setting is one part of that question, I'm supposing, but also probably a general question as well.
Yeah, and sometimes this comes up with about, airborne respirations. Is it in the air? And, we don't have a lot of data to think that this is this airborne transmission, that if we're breathing air outside, we're going to catch coronavirus. What I tell people about masks are really to protect self and others. We have learned lately there is some protection of yourself, but mostly others. But it's around when you're around other people when you can't socially distance. So if you're out on a walk by yourself with no one possibly coming around you, you don't need to wear a mask. The reason why I still tell people to bring masks when they're jogging or running or going on a hike, sometimes you end up in a bottleneck, right, on a path or somewhere where you can't get through, and all of a sudden you're around people for 5 or 10 minutes, people are breathing heavy, and that's where you potentially could have transmission. But again, the mask is mostly when you're around other people and you can't socially distance. You can't always predict when you're out publicly when you're going to run in to other people. Remember that you're not going to catch coronavirus. The risk is very low that you touch a doorknob or someone walks by you. That's not enough viral load for you to, put through your respiratory system and all of a sudden become infected. So that's why the mask is still good for you, so you don't touch your face, touch your nose, touch your eyes, touch your mouth, as well as if you're an asymptomatic carrier, that you're not spewing virus when you talk to other people. And what's happening, Mike, is none of us think we spit when we talk, but we actually all do. We don't see the respiratory droplets, but there are respiratory droplets that are coming out, of my mouth right now. So that's what we want to be careful about. And that's why people that are shouting and people that are singing, that's why we're seeing a lot in choirs, because people are talking loudly and they're expelling virus. And that's what we want to prevent. So wear those masks outside when you're around other people and you're going to come into contact with other people. But if you're outside by yourself, then you don't need to. For kids, it's very hard to say they're going to be outside by themselves. They're going to probably be around other kids. So I would try to get them to wear the mask for now until we have greater control of what's happening with transmission.
The other thing you mentioned there was this 5 to 10 minute comment. What about this duration of interaction? I've heard things say 15 minutes. Prolonged interaction is when you're most likely to have potentially have an airborne transmission mechanism between two people, or is that not the latest thinking, or where do we stand on that timing?
Hopkins published data recently that they think you really need to have 15 to 30 minutes at least of prolonged exposure. So just I get it. But you for 15 minutes and you're breathing on my back, you're breathing on my face, or, I'm sitting at a conference room table for you for, 45 minutes and everyone's talking to each other without socially distanced, that's where there's, increased risk. Less likely touching the elevator. It's really 15 to 30 minutes, exposed to the virus.
Mhm. And extracurricular activities, big topic we didn't touch on at all. There's a few questions that came in. Of course, big part of children's development. What do you have any, just offer any thoughts on that, sports or otherwise?
Yeah, a lot of sports, has been canceled. What I've seen in the summer, and the Surgeon General and I have talked about this, it kind of depends on the sport. People are saying tennis is an okay sport, and it makes sense because, right, person's far away from you on the other side, you're not having a lot of contact. That makes a lot of sense. Baseball, could be in terms of if you're, especially in younger leagues, you're not having a lot of contact with other people, you're standing far apart, on the outfield. Things like football and soccer, where there's a lot of contact, it becomes much more challenging, to keep everyone safe, again, depending upon what's happening in the community. So I can see how for a lot of people in the fall that, they're canceling many of these activities, for safety reasons and the concern. So I think it goes to, some of those sports perhaps that people can play that really minimize contact. But in terms of high school football and high school soccer, I'm not so sure we're going to see them, in the fall and right now for good reason based on, spread in the community.
Another question here I wrote down. Is there too much focus on sanitizer at the expense of airflow? Or just ideas around airflow? And a couple of questions actually interestingly about schools that are in older buildings, people concerned that maybe those buildings have older sort of recirculation systems and the like that would not be.
Yeah, there's been a couple of really good articles about this. Actually, to your point, saying that we're talking too much about sanitation, we're spending too much money on sanitation, and we're going to bankrupt county governments on sanitation, and that really we need to focus on mask wearing. If everyone wore a mask and everyone was hand washing, we'd have less virus around to have to do all this sanitation. And that sanitizing every night may not be, the best thing in terms of ultimately our immune system. So I think that's a good point, that we may be overdoing it on, the need for daily sanitation if we would require mask wearing for everyone. The other aspect is, you're right, in terms of the air systems and the filtration systems. That's why we're saying, especially early on, if schools are going to open, let's keep, windows open. Let's try to be outside. That's, more of an issue that we need to think about in terms of, what's the air filtration system in the schools? And let's get some good data on that. I agree with that. I think we should be spending more time on that than we should be in terms of, this over aggressive sanitation at the expense of some other mitigation strategies.
Yeah, great, thanks for that. And I know we're just getting up on the hour here, and we really greatly appreciate your time. Maybe I'll wrap up here before with one final question. What would be your advice you would offer to those in a position of influence as it relates to a school decision at present?
Yeah.
If you want to summarize.
Yeah, I would say the schools have to look at data, and especially in their community, and explain to parents and employees the reasoning behind the decision making. And for me, what's been frustrating is when I hear districts say, well, someone's going to die of COVID if we reopen the schools. That's not helpful for policy making and for decision making. And we have to include all parties. Something that I thought was good in some districts is they've been querying parents and querying, employees as to what they feel is the best process. And then to have a lot of communication. And unfortunately, I don't think there's been a lot of, good communication with parents. The decisions are being made at the last minute, and parents have childcare issues, they have work issues. from, our leaders, we're not always getting, timely information, based on data in ways that we can act upon. And I'd like to see more of that going forward.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more there, because as a data person myself, that's just, it's right up my alley. So thank you for that affirmation. And again, thank you for the time here.
Absolutely.
We really, really appreciate it. I heard a lot of great insights, I think, that, resonate with me. This idea of thinking local, very important. You reiterated it there. And I think consistency too, consistency of approach, because I think if I can summarize some of the frustrations that you hear, sometimes it's about inconsistent approaches and not clarity on what's driving the decisions. And so consistency is great too. And then balance, right? This is a balance. There is no perfect solution. Nothing comes without risk, but there's no way we get to zero risk no matter what we do. So it's going to be, appropriate and important to have balance in all of this. So we hope you'll join us again, maybe for an update sometime in the coming months, Doctor. Really a nice time speaking with you. I can tell from all the questions that we got that it did resonate with all of our folks. So thank you again. Sure. And for those that are on the line, we really appreciate you joining us today, and stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be coming your way shortly. With that, have a great day, everybody.